The room held its breath. 40 of the most dangerous men in southern Europe sat around a mahogany table in the private salon of the Grand Hotel Meridiana, and not one of them moved. Camilla Ruggieri stood at the far end of the room, her chestnut hair falling in soft waves against the collar of her ivory dress, and she had just done something no living person had ever done before. She had corrected Gabriele Montoro. Not privately, not with deference. She had looked directly into those cold, unblinking eyes, and she had told him he was wrong. The silence that followed could have swallowed the building whole. Every man at that table understood the same brutal arithmetic. People who embarrassed Gabriele Montoro did not get to finish their evening. His right hand rested on the table, knuckles facing upward. The ink was visible to everyone. Silenzio across one set of knuckles, Controllo across the other. The black-gray spiral of the serpent tattoo climbed from beneath his open collar, coiling along the side of his neck, disappearing into the darkness of his perfectly tailored suit. He was still, completely, terrifyingly still. And then something happened that not a single person in that room expected. He smiled, not widely, not warmly, just the faintest shift at the corner of his mouth. Barely perceptible, like a crack forming in marble. His eyes never left hers. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her with something no one in that room had ever seen on his face before. Curiosity. Before we begin this story, I want you to know that every like, every share, and every subscription helps bring more stories like this to life. If this one grabs you, stay until the very end. You won't regret it. Please like, share, and subscribe. The evening had started 3 hours earlier, in the way that all of Camilla Ruggieri's evenings started, with precision, elegance, and absolute control over every detail that most people would never notice. She stood in the service corridor behind the Grand Hotel Meridiana's private salon, clipboard in hand, earpiece fitted discreetly beneath her hair, watching her team of 12 execute the final preparations for what had been billed as a cultural acquisitions gala. The flowers were Sicilian jasmine, hand-selected that morning. The lighting was set at exactly 2,700 Kelvin, warm enough to flatter, dim enough to suggest intimacy. The string quartet knew to play Debussy during cocktails and shift to silence the moment dinner was served. Camilla had curated events for oligarchs, diplomats, and old-money families across Europe for nearly 5 years. She had built her reputation on a simple philosophy. Every environment tells a story, and the person who controls the environment controls the narrative. Tonight, however, the narrative was not hers to control. She had known for weeks that the Montoro syndicate would be represented at this event. The gala was hosted by the Ferrante family, legitimate on paper, deeply entangled in Naples' shadow economy in practice. But the invitation list had expanded beyond expectation. What should have been 40 guests had become 60. What should have been a civilized evening of art and wine had become something else entirely, a meeting ground. And at the center of that ground stood a man she had only heard about in whispers. Gabriele Montoro. She had done her research as she always did. Age 33. Head of the Montoro syndicate since the age of 26, when his father had died under circumstances that no one dared investigate. Known in certain circles as Il Serpente, the serpent. Not because he struck quickly, but because he never needed to. He watched. He waited. He positioned himself so perfectly that, by the time his enemies realized they were caught, the coils had already tightened. She had seen photographs. Dark hair, styled back with the kind of discipline that suggested a man who controlled every element of his appearance. Lean build, not the bulk of a man who relied on physical intimidation, but the defined, coiled strength of someone who understood that real power was quiet. Light olive skin, eyes that every source described the same way, cold. And then there were the tattoos. Every profile, every whispered account mentioned them. The serpent, black and gray, spiraling from the side of his neck, across his shoulder, disappearing into his chest. And the knuckles, Silenzio on one hand, Controllo on the other, silence and control. The twin pillars of his philosophy, inked permanently into his skin, visible every time he reached for a glass, adjusted a cuff, or rested his hands on a table. Camilla had processed all of this information the way she processed everything, clinically, efficiently, without emotional attachment. He was a variable in her event. A significant variable, certainly, but a variable nonetheless. She would ensure the evening ran smoothly, that no protocols were breached, that the Ferrante family was satisfied with her work, and that she never had to think about Gabrielle Montoro again. That was the plan. Plans, as she would soon learn, meant very little to a man who had spent his entire life dismantling them. The first hour of the gala proceeded exactly as designed. Guests arrived in waves, the legitimate contacts first, then the intermediaries, then the principals. Camilla moved through the margins of the event like a ghost, adjusting a centerpiece here, redirecting a server there, ensuring that the ecosystem of the evening functioned with invisible precision. She noticed him the moment he entered, though she would never have admitted it. He came through the main entrance with two men flanking him. One she would later learn was Marco Ferretti, his right-hand man, and the other a security detail who positioned himself by the door and did not move for the rest of the night. Gabrielle himself moved through the room the way water moves through a channel, without effort, without resistance, as though the space had been designed specifically to accommodate him. He wore a dark suit, nearly black, tailored so precisely that it seemed less like clothing and more like architecture. The collar was open, one button undone, and the serpent tattoo was immediately visible, the dark ink climbing the side of his neck, the coils catching the warm light of the room. His hands were at his sides, relaxed, and even from across the salon, Camilla could see the letters. Silenzio, Controllo. He spoke to no one as he entered. He simply moved to the far end of the room, accepted a glass of wine from a server without looking at her, and positioned himself where he could see every door, every face, every movement. Camilla watched him for exactly 4 seconds, then returned to her work. She didn't know that in those same 4 seconds, he had already seen her. The trouble began during the second hour, when the event transitioned from cocktails to the private salon. The Ferrante patriarch, Don Enzo, had requested a seated discussion, ostensibly about a collection of Renaissance bronzes that were being offered through a private estate sale. In reality, the discussion was about territory, influence, and the shifting alliances that had destabilized Naples' power structure over the past year. Camilla's role should have ended at the threshold of the salon. She was an event curator, not a participant. But Don Enzo had specifically requested her presence during the discussion to manage the presentation of the bronzes, to speak to their provenance, their value, their cultural significance. It was, she understood, a performance. The art gave the meeting legitimacy. She gave the art credibility. She was a prop in someone else's theater. She accepted the role because it was professional, because the Ferrante family paid extraordinarily well, and because she had learned long ago that in the world she operated in, proximity to power was inevitable. The only choice was whether you stood in its shadow or its light. She chose the light, always. The salon was arranged with the mahogany table at its center, 40 seats filled with men whose combined influence could reshape the political landscape of 3 countries. Camilla stood near the presentation easel, her notes prepared, her posture perfect, her expression composed. Gabrielle Montoro sat at the head of the table's left wing. Not at the center, that was Don Enzo's position, but at the place of greatest strategic advantage, where he could observe both the speaker and the reactions of everyone else in the room. His jacket was buttoned once. His hands rested on the table. The ink on his knuckles was stark against the mahogany. Marco Ferretti, his right-hand man, sat to his immediate left. Marco was a different kind of presence. Stocky, watchful, with the energy of a man who was constantly calculating exit strategies. He had a soldier's posture and an accountant's eyes. He glanced at Camilla once when she began speaking, and something in his expression shifted. Not attraction, but assessment. He was cataloging her, filing her away. Camilla began her presentation. She spoke about the bronzes with the practiced ease of someone who genuinely understood what she was talking about. She traced the lineage of each piece. A small Mercury attributed to Giambologna's workshop, a pair of candlestick bases from the Palazzo Vecchio, a fragmentary relief that bore the hallmarks of Cellini's technique. Her voice was clear, measured, unhurried. She was, in that moment, the only person in the room who was not performing. And that was what caught his attention. Gabriel watched her the way he watched everything, without visible reaction, without movement, his eyes tracking her gestures, her pauses, the way she held the room without demanding it. He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who were trying to be something, trying to project strength, trying to project loyalty, trying to project relevance. This woman was doing none of those things. She was simply present, simply competent, simply herself. It unsettled him in a way he did not immediately understand. The disruption came from the opposite end of the table. Vittorio Sana, a Sardinian boss with more ambition than judgment, had been growing visibly impatient throughout the presentation. He was a large man, loud in the way that insecure men often are, and he had been drinking since before the cocktail hour. He interrupted Camilla mid-sentence, waving a thick hand dismissively. "Enough about the bronzes," he said, his voice carrying the wet heaviness of too much wine. "We all know why we're here. Don Enzo, let's discuss the port allocations. This cultural theater is wasting everyone's time." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Don Enzo's expression tightened. Camilla paused, her hand still raised toward the mercury bronze, and simply waited. She did not flinch. She did not react. She waited with the patience of someone who understood that silence was its own kind of authority. It was Gabriel who spoke next, and when he did, the room went absolutely still. "Signor Sana." His voice was soft. Not quiet, soft. There was a difference. Quiet was the absence of volume. Soft was the presence of control. People leaned in to hear him, and in leaning in, they submitted. "Don Enzo has arranged this evening with particular care. The signorina is speaking. You will let her finish." It was not a request. It was not a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same calm certainty with which one might observe that the sky was blue or that water was wet. Sana's face reddened, but he said nothing. No one at that table was foolish enough to challenge Gabriel Montoro over a point of etiquette, because etiquette in his world was never just etiquette. It was hierarchy. It was respect. And disrespect, no matter how small, was a debt that he always collected. Camilla registered the intervention without acknowledgement. She resumed her presentation, her voice unchanged, her composure untouched. But something had shifted in the room's geometry. Before, she had been a prop, a professional brought in to decorate a meeting with legitimacy. Now she was something else. She was someone Gabriel Montoro had publicly protected. And that, in this room, meant everything. She finished the presentation 12 minutes later, answered 3 questions about provenance and authentication with a precision that impressed even the men who had no interest in art, and stepped back from the easel. Don Enzo thanked her with a nod. The discussion shifted to the real business of the evening: territory, logistics, the careful redistribution of influence that kept the peace among families who would happily destroy each other given sufficient provocation. Camilla should have left. Her work was done. She gathered her notes, aligned the presentation materials with the habitual neatness that defined every aspect of her professional life, and turned toward the door. But Sana was not finished. He had been stewing since Gabriel's quiet rebuke, the humiliation fermenting in his gut alongside the wine. As Camilla moved past his section of the table, he spoke again, not to her directly, but loud enough for the room to hear. "At least the view was pleasant," he said, his eyes tracking her body with undisguised entitlement. Don Enzo always did know how to decorate a room. The silence that followed was different from before. This was not the silence of anticipation. This was the silence of a room full of men who understood that a line had been crossed and were now calculating the consequences. Camilla stopped walking. She turned, slowly, and looked directly at Vittorio Sana. Her expression was not angry. It was not offended. It was the expression of a woman who had long ago decided that men like Sana were not worth the energy of genuine emotion. "The mercury bronze," she said, her voice perfectly level, "is valued at approximately 800,000 euros. The Cellini fragment conservatively at twice that. The candlestick bases, as a pair, at 300,000. She paused. "I have just presented you with nearly 3 million euros worth of cultural patrimony, authenticated, provenance verified, and legally transferable. If the only value you perceived in the last 30 minutes was aesthetic, Senior Sana, then I would respectfully suggest that the deficiency lies with the viewer, not the view. The room didn't breathe. And then, from the head of the left wing, came the sound that no one expected. Gabriel Montoro laughed. It was short, barely more than an exhale, a single note of genuine amusement that escaped the fortress of his self-control before he could catch it. His hand was resting on the table, silenzio visible across his knuckles, and the serpent tattoo shifted almost imperceptibly along his neck as his head tilted slightly. He looked at her. She looked at him. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, something was established. Something that could not be undone, could not be unfelt, could not be negotiated or controlled or strategized away. It was the recognition of equals. The sudden, disorienting awareness that across a room full of powerful men, the only person who matched him, who truly, fundamentally matched him, was a woman holding a clipboard and wearing an ivory dress. Camilla held his gaze for one more heartbeat, then turned and walked out of the salon. She did not look back. He did not stop watching. Marco Ferretti, sitting at Gabrielle's left, noticed the entire exchange. He noticed the laugh, because he had worked for Gabrielle for 9 years and could count on one hand the number of times he had heard the man laugh. He noticed the look, because Gabrielle's eyes were weapons, and they did not linger on anything that wasn't either a threat or an asset. This was neither. This was something else. Marco leaned slightly toward his boss as the room resumed its murmured negotiations. Should I find out who she is? Gabrielle's hand turned on the table, the letters Contrallo catching the light. The serpent on his neck was still coiled, patient. I already know who she is, he said quietly. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The tone in his voice was one Marco had heard before. Rare, dangerous, and always preceding something that changed the landscape permanently. Later that night, Camilla stood alone on the terrace of her rented apartment overlooking the Bay of Naples. The city sparkled beneath her. A constellation of lights scattered across the dark hills, reflected in the black water. She had changed out of the ivory dress into something simple, a linen shirt and loose trousers, and her hair was down, the chestnut waves catching the salt breeze. She replayed the evening in her mind with her characteristic precision. The presentation had gone well. The Ferrante family would be satisfied. Sana's comment had been predictable. Men like him always reduced women to decoration when they felt intellectually outmatched. Her response had been measured, appropriate, and effective. What she could not categorize, what resisted her usual clinical analysis, was the other thing. His laugh. She had heard about Gabriel Montoro for years. Fragments of reputation that accumulated like sediment. Cold, calculating, dangerous, patient. A man who controlled everything and everyone around him with the precision of a chess master and the detachment of a surgeon. And yet, in that moment, when she had dismantled Sana's vulgarity with nothing but facts and composure, something had broken through his surface. She had made the most controlled man in the room lose control, for exactly 1 second, and in that second, she had seen something behind his eyes that contradicted everything she had heard about him. Not cruelty. Not calculation. Something rawer, something that looked almost like recognition. She pressed her palms against the terrace railing and breathed the salt air and told herself it didn't matter. 3 days later, her phone rang. The caller identified himself as a representative of a private collector who wished to engage her services for an appraisal of a significant personal collection. The terms were generous, extraordinarily generous. The location was a private estate outside Ravello, along the Amalfi coast. Transportation would be provided. The engagement would last 1 day. Camilla asked for the collector's name. There was a pause on the line. Signor Montoro prefers to discuss the details in person, the voice said. Camilla stood in her office, the phone pressed to her ear, and stared at the wall where a small reproduction of Caravaggio's Judith beheading Holofernes hung. A gift from her father years ago, before everything had fallen apart. Judith's expression in the painting had always fascinated her. Not horror, not triumph, just focus. The calm, steady focus of a woman doing what needed to be done. Tell Signor Montoro, Camilla said, that I require a written inventory of the collection in advance, a formal engagement letter specifying scope and compensation, and the guarantee that the appraisal will be conducted in a professionally appropriate setting. Another pause. Senor Montoro anticipated you would say that. He asked me to tell you that the documents are already prepared and will be delivered to your office by courier within the hour. Camilla ended the call and stood motionless for a long time. He had anticipated her. He had known exactly what she would ask for and had prepared it in advance. He had studied her. Not casually, not superficially. He had studied her the way she studied provenance, tracing the lines backward until the full picture emerged. It should have unnerved her. What unnerved her more was that it didn't. The estate outside Ravello sat on a cliff above the sea, white stone and ancient tile, surrounded by lemon groves and silence. Camilla arrived at 10 in the morning in a car that had been sent for her, a black sedan with tinted windows and a driver who spoke exactly 0 words during the 90-minute journey from Naples. The grounds were immaculate. The gardens were maintained with the kind of precision that required either obsession or an army of groundskeepers, and possibly both. A housekeeper met her at the entrance. A small, sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Signora Valente and led Camilla through a series of rooms that grew progressively more beautiful and progressively more guarded. The collection was housed in a private gallery on the estate's 2nd floor. The room was climate-controlled, lit with museum-grade fixtures, and contained approximately 40 pieces ranging from 16th-century Florentine panels to contemporary works by artists Camilla recognized immediately. It was, without exaggeration, one of the finest private collections she had ever seen. She set down her bag, removed her appraisal kit, and began working. For 40 minutes, she was alone with the art, and for those 40 minutes, she was in her element. Focused, precise, immersed in the language of brushstrokes and pigments and the stories they told across centuries. She was examining a small oil study, possibly Artemisia gentileschi, though the attribution would require further analysis, when she became aware that she was no longer alone. She didn't hear him enter. She didn't hear footsteps or a door opening or any of the ordinary sounds that announce a human presence. She simply felt the room change, felt the air shift, felt the quality of the silence alter from empty to occupied. She turned, and Gabriel Montoro was standing in the doorway. He wore a dark shirt, open at the collar, sleeves rolled to the forearms. The serpent tattoo was fully visible, climbing his neck, disappearing beneath the fabric at his shoulder. The detail of the scales rendered with an almost artistic precision that Camilla's professional eye registered involuntarily. The coils on his forearm were exposed, the dark ink stark against his light olive skin. His hands hung at his sides, and the knuckle tattoos were unmistakable even in the soft gallery light. Silenzio, controllo. He was watching her the way he had watched her at the gala, with that same still, absolute attention that felt less like observation and more like absorption. "You found the gentileschi," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered, soft, controlled, the kind of voice that made you lean forward without realizing you were doing it. Camilla turned back to the painting. "Possibly gentileschi. The palette is consistent, and the handling of the flesh tones suggests her workshop at minimum. But the panel size is unusual for her documented works, and there's an area of overpainting in the lower left that would need to be examined under infrared before I could commit to an attribution." She heard him move closer. Not quickly, slowly, deliberately, each step measured. He stopped approximately 4 feet behind her, close enough that she could detect the faint scent of his cologne. Something dark, resinous, like cedar and smoke. Far enough that it maintained the boundary of professional propriety. But only just. "My father acquired it from a dealer in Rome," Gabrielle said. 30 years ago. He was told it was a studio copy. He paid accordingly. Your father may have gotten a significant bargain. My father had good instincts about value." A pause. In some things, the weight in those last 3 words was unmistakable. Camilla filed it away, the first crack in the facade, the first suggestion that Gabriel Montoro's relationship with his dead father was more complicated than the public narrative suggested. She continued her appraisal, moving methodically through the collection, making notes, photographing details, measuring dimensions. Gabrielle remained in the gallery, sometimes standing, sometimes sitting in a leather chair near the window, always watching. He asked occasional questions, intelligent, specific questions that revealed a genuine understanding of art history and connoisseurship. He never interrupted her work. He never crowded her space. But his presence was constant, gravitational. At noon, Signora Valente appeared with lunch. A simple arrangement of bread, cheese, olives, and wine, set on a small table near the gallery's windows overlooking the sea. Gabrielle gestured for Camilla to sit. She considered declining, considered maintaining the professional boundary that had kept her safe and solvent for 5 years. Instead, she sat. They ate in near silence for several minutes. The view from the window was staggering. The Amalfi coastline falling away in dramatic folds of green and white. The sea impossibly blue beneath the midday sun. "Why this?" Camilla asked, breaking the silence. Gabrielle looked at her. "Why what?" "The collection, the gallery, the climate control, the museum-grade lighting. This isn't decoration. This is preservation. This is care." She met his eyes. "Men in your position collect art as investment or as status. You collect it because it matters to you." For a moment, something moved behind his eyes. That same raw, unguarded thing she had glimpsed at the gala. Then it was gone, sealed behind the composure that was as much a part of him as the ink on his skin. "My mother painted," he said. The words came out simply, without performance, without weight. But Camilla heard the tense. "Painted," past tense. "She taught me to look at things," he continued. "Not at what they appeared to be, at what they were." He lifted his glass. The letters on his knuckles caught the light. "Silenzio." He drank, set the glass down, and the letters on the other hand appeared. "Controllo." "When she died," he said, "I was 14. The first thing my father did was remove her paintings from the house. Every canvas, every sketch. He said they were sentimental. He said sentiment was a vulnerability." He paused. "The second thing he did was have these done." He turned his hands over, knuckles up, displaying the tattoos with a matter-of-factness that startled her. "He held my hands down himself. I was 14. The tattooist argued, said I was too young, that the bones weren't fully formed. My father told him to do it anyway." His voice hadn't changed. Still soft, still controlled. But beneath the surface, Camilla could feel something enormous moving. Something volcanic, held in place by sheer force of will. He said I needed to remember. Silence. Control. Always. Camilla looked at his hands, and for the first time she saw them differently. Not as symbols of power, as scars. "And the serpent?" she asked quietly. "That was mine," he said. "I chose it when I was 20, after he died." The faintest pause. "It represents patience, the ability to wait, to watch, to know exactly when to move." He looked at her, and the coldness in his eyes was not cold at all. It was depth disguised as distance. "But it also represents something else. Something I didn't understand until I was older." "What?" "The fact that no matter how still you remain, no matter how carefully you coil, the past is always wrapped around you. You carry it on your skin whether you choose to or not." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had, without intending to, stepped past the boundary of formality into something more honest, more dangerous, more real. Camilla understood in that moment what she was looking at. Not a monster, not a machine. A man who had been taught to eliminate every vulnerability, who had built an empire on silence and control, and who had just, for no strategic reason she could identify, shown her the wound beneath the armor. She should have been afraid. She was not afraid. Later that afternoon, as Camilla completed her appraisal and began packing her equipment, Gabrielle walked her through the lower floor of the estate. He moved beside her, not behind her, not ahead, beside her. The serpent tattoo was visible above his collar with every step, and his hands were relaxed, the knuckle tattoos catching fragments of light through the corridor windows. Marco Ferretti appeared at the end of the hallway, his stocky frame blocking the light from the garden entrance. His eyes moved from Gabrielle to Camilla and back again, and something in his expression tightened. Not hostility, but wariness. The wariness of a man who had seen his boss navigate every kind of threat and had never once seen him navigate this. "The car is ready," Marco said. Gabrielle nodded, then turned to Camilla. They stood in the corridor, the afternoon light painting long shadows across the tile floor. He was close enough that she could see the individual scales of the serpent tattoo where it curved along his neck, the precision of the line work, the subtle shading that gave the snake dimension and movement even on still skin. "Your preliminary assessment," he said. "When can I expect it?" "Within the week." "And the Gentileschi?" "I'll need to arrange infrared analysis. That requires equipment I don't have here. If you're willing to have it transported to a lab in Rome." "I'm willing," he said, and the speed of his agreement told her that the Gentileschi was not really what he was asking about. She met his eyes, held them, in the language of his world, a world she understood better than he realized. Sustained eye contact was either a challenge or an invitation. She intended it as neither. She intended it as honesty. "Signor Montoro." "Gabrielle." "Signor Montoro," she repeated, deliberate. "I want to be clear about the nature of this engagement. I am here in a professional capacity. My assessment of your collection will be thorough, objective, and entirely independent of any other considerations." He studied her face. The silence stretched. Then, very quietly, he said, "I would expect nothing less." She nodded, turned, and walked toward the waiting car. She did not look back. But as the sedan pulled away from the estate, she glanced in the side mirror and saw him standing in the entrance, hands at his sides, the serpent visible on his neck, watching the car until it disappeared around the curve of the hillside road. Signora Valente appeared beside Marco as they watched the car leave. Marco exhaled slowly. "She's going to be a problem." Gabrielle said nothing. "Boss," Marco pressed, "I've seen you negotiate with arms dealers, politicians, and men who would kill you in your sleep. I have never seen you tell anyone about your mother." Still nothing. "Who is she?" Gabrielle turned from the entrance. The light caught the serpent tattoo as he moved, the coils seeming to shift with the motion of his body. His hands were in his pockets, the knuckle tattoos hidden. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Marco had ever heard it. "She's the daughter of Enzo Ruggieri." Marco's face changed. "Ruggieri? As in?" "Yes. As in the Ruggieri who?" "Yes." Marco stared at him. "Does she know?" Gabrielle walked past him into the house. "She knows her father was betrayed. She knows her family was destroyed. She knows the life she was supposed to live was taken from her before she was old enough to understand why." "Does she know who did it?" Gabrielle paused at the threshold, his hand on the doorframe, the letter Silenzio visible against the dark wood. "Not yet," he said. He went inside. Days passed. Camilla threw herself into the appraisal with the same meticulous discipline she applied to everything. She worked from her office in Naples, a small, beautiful space on the third floor of a building near the Via dei Tribunali, surrounded by reference books, authentication files, and the quiet hum of a dehumidifier that kept the air at optimal conditions for the documents she stored. She told herself the work was purely professional. She told herself that the conversation in the gallery, his mother, his father, the tattoos, was an anomaly, a momentary lapse in a man whose entire existence was built on never lapsing. She told herself she was not thinking about the way his voice sounded when he said the word patience, or the way the serpent on his neck moved when he turned his head, or the way he had looked at her in the corridor as if she were a painting he was trying to authenticate. She told herself all of these things with the discipline that had defined her life since she was 17 years old and had come home from school to find her father sitting alone in an empty house, surrounded by the debris of a life that had been systematically dismantled overnight. Enzo Ruggieri had been a man of moderate importance in Naples' complicated ecosystem, not powerful enough to be feared, not insignificant enough to be ignored. He had operated in the space between legitimate business and the shadow economy, providing financial services to families who could not use traditional banks. He had been careful. He had been discreet. And then, one day, he had been destroyed. Camilla had never learned the full story. Her father would not speak of it. Not then, not in the years that followed, as he rebuilt a fraction of his former life in a small apartment in Posillipo, working as a bookkeeper for a shipping company, his dignity intact but his spirit visibly broken. She knew only the outlines. A betrayal, a power shift, a decision made by someone above him that had resulted in the erasure of everything her family had built. She had responded to this catastrophe the way she responded to everything, by building something of her own. Something that no one could take from her. Her expertise, her reputation, her professional identity. These were hers, earned through years of study and work, independent of family connections or inherited power. She had made herself indispensable in a world that viewed women as accessories, and she had done it without compromise. Until now. Now, sitting in her office with Gabrielle Montoro's collection spread across her desk in photographs and notes, she felt the first tremor of something she had not felt in a very long time. Uncertainty. Not about the art. The art was clear. The collection was exceptional, genuinely, museum-quality exceptional, and the possible Gentileschi alone could redefine the artist's catalogue raisonné if authenticated. The professional assessment would be straightforward. The uncertainty was about everything else. A week after the visit to the estate, she received an invitation. Not from a representative this time, from Gabrielle directly. A handwritten note, delivered by courier, on heavy cream paper embossed with a single monogram. The note read, "The Fondazione Mergellina is hosting a reception for their new acquisition. A Solvatore Rosa that I understand you authenticated last year. I will be attending. I would like you to be there." No signature. No explanation. Just the date, the time, and the address. She stared at the note for a long time. The handwriting was precise, controlled, each letter formed with deliberate care. Even his penmanship was disciplined. She went. She told herself it was professional. The Fondazione was a significant client. The Solvatore Rosa authentication had been one of her most important commissions. Her presence was appropriate, expected even. She wore a dress the color of deep wine. Elegant, fitted, with a high neckline and a back that was open just enough to suggest without revealing. Her hair was down, the chestnut waves falling past her shoulders. She wore no jewelry except a small gold chain that had been her mother's. Her mother, who had left when Camilla was 12, unable to bear the weight of a life lived in the margins of someone else's decisions. The Fondazione Mergellina occupied a restored palazzo near the waterfront. The reception was smaller than the Ferrante Gala, perhaps 80 guests, a mix of collectors, critics, cultural officials, and the inevitable contingent of people whose money came from sources that no one discussed in polite company. Camilla arrived alone, as she always did. She moved through the room with her practiced ease, greeting colleagues, discussing the Rosa acquisition with the Fondazione's director, examining the painting's installation with a critical eye. She felt him before she saw him. That same shift in the room's atmosphere, the same subtle alteration of pressure and attention that she had felt in the gallery at Ravello. She turned, and there he was, standing near the far wall with Marco Ferretti at his side. Dark suit, open collar, the serpent tattoo climbing his neck. His hands around a glass of wine, the knuckle tattoos visible as his fingers curved around the crystal. He was already looking at her. She held his gaze for a moment, then deliberately turned back to the director and resumed her conversation. It was a small act of defiance, a reminder to herself as much as to him that she was not a woman who could be summoned by a look. 20 minutes later, she was standing alone in front of the Solvatore Rosa, a dramatic landscape, dark and turbulent, the kind of painting that made you feel the wind, when his voice came from beside her. "You authenticated this." She did not turn. "I did. It's extraordinary." "It is." "How do you know?" he asked. "How do you look at something and know with certainty that it is what it claims to be?" Now she turned. He was standing closer than he had been at Ravello, perhaps 2 feet away, angled toward the painting but facing her. The serpent tattoo was fully visible, the coils catching the gallery's overhead light. His forearms were exposed where his sleeves were slightly pushed back, and the continuation of the tattoo's design was visible, the serpent's body extending down from the shoulder, the scales rendered in meticulous detail. "Consistency," she said. You look at every element, the materials, the technique, the aging patterns, the provenance documentation, and you ask whether they tell the same story. Forgeries fail because they can never achieve total consistency. There's always a contradiction, a pigment that wasn't available until decades after the supposed date, a canvas weave that doesn't match the region, a brush technique that's technically perfect but emotionally empty. She paused. Authenticity isn't about perfection. It's about coherence. Real things have contradictions too, but their contradictions make sense. They're human. He was watching her with that absolute attention again, the attention that felt like being seen not just on the surface but all the way through. And people? He asked. Can you authenticate people? People are harder, she said. People are always performing. Are you performing now? Are you? The silence between them was electric. Around them, the reception continued. Conversations, laughter, the clink of glasses. But in the 2 feet of space between Gabriele Montoro and Camilla Ruggieri, the rest of the world had ceased to exist. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, with the controlled precision that defined everything about him. He reached toward her face, and for a moment, she thought he was going to touch her cheek. Instead, his fingers stopped a centimeter from her skin, hovering near a strand of hair that the breeze from the air conditioning had displaced across her forehead. May I? He said. The question itself was a revelation. A man who controlled empires was asking permission to move a strand of hair. She nodded once. His fingertips brushed her forehead as he guided the strand back into place. The touch lasted less than a second. The letters on his knuckles, Silenzio, were close enough to read without effort. His skin was warm. Then his hand dropped, and the distance between them reasserted itself, and the moment was over. But something had started that could not be stopped. Across the room, Marco Ferretti watched the exchange with the expression of a man watching a lit match fall toward gasoline. He shifted his weight, adjusted his jacket, and made a mental note to run a comprehensive background check on Camilla Ruggieri that went far deeper than anything his boss had shared. Because Marco knew something that Gabriele had not yet acknowledged to himself. The last person who had gotten this close to Gabriele Montoro, close enough to breach the walls, close enough to see behind the mask, had been his mother. And his mother had been destroyed by the very world that Gabriele now ruled. If Camilla stayed in his orbit, she would become a target. And targets, in their world, had a very specific trajectory. The weeks that followed established a pattern that Camilla recognized but could not bring herself to break. Gabriele did not pursue her in any conventional sense. There were no flowers, no extravagant gifts, no displays of wealth designed to impress. Instead, he appeared at events she was curating, at galleries she was visiting, at restaurants where she was dining alone with a book. He never imposed. He never intruded. He simply occupied the same spaces she occupied, and in those spaces the gravity between them did its quiet, inevitable work. They talked about art, about history, about the psychology of beauty and the economics of culture. They argued about Caravaggio. She believed his violence was autobiographical. He believed it was strategic. They agreed about Artemisia Gentileschi. Her Judith was the greatest single painting of the 17th century. They disagreed about contemporary art. She found value in abstraction. He considered it evasion. Each conversation peeled another layer from the surface. She learned that he read voraciously, philosophy, history, poetry, that he spoke 4 languages fluently and could read 2 more, that he had been educated at a private school in Switzerland that had expelled him at 16 for reasons he would not discuss, and that he had completed his education through tutors hired by his father, tutors who taught him economics, strategy, and the art of reading people. He learned that she had studied art history at the University of Bologna, that she had spent a year in Florence working in a conservation laboratory, that she could identify a painting's geographic origin by the composition of its ground layer. He learned that she lived alone, that she cooked elaborate meals for herself on weekends, that she listened to opera while she worked in jazz when she couldn't sleep. He learned that she visited her father every Sunday. And he learned, though she did not tell him directly, that the subject of her family's downfall was the one door she kept locked. It was on a Wednesday evening, 5 weeks after the Fondazione reception, that the pattern fractured. Camilla was curating a private showing at a gallery in the Chiaia district, a small exhibition of Neapolitan landscape paintings from the 18th century. The client was a Swiss collector named Hauser, a man in his 50s who had been one of her earliest professional contacts and who had always treated her with respect bordering on fatherly warmth. Gabrielle had not been expected. The event was small, intimate, far below the radar of the world he inhabited. But at 8 in the evening, as Camilla was walking Hauser through the exhibition's final room, Marco Ferretti appeared at the gallery entrance, scanned the room with professional efficiency, and stepped aside. Gabrielle entered. He wore a dark coat over his suit, the collar turned up against the October chill. The serpent tattoo on his neck was partially hidden by the coat's collar, but as he unbuttoned and handed the coat to Marco, it emerged in full, the dark coils climbing, the scales catching the gallery's warm light. His forearms were covered by his suit sleeves tonight, but as he adjusted his cuffs, a habitual gesture she had learned to recognize, the edge of the tattoo's extension was briefly visible at his wrist. His knuckles, as always, were bare and readable. Silenzio. Controllo. Hauser noticed the newcomer and went very still. Camilla saw it, saw the recognition in his eyes, saw the color drain slightly from his face, saw the precise moment when the Swiss collector realized that the man who had just walked into his private showing was someone for whom galleries and art exhibitions were not a natural habitat. "Herr Hauser," Camilla said, her voice steady, bridging the gap before it could widen. "This is Signor Montoro. He's a private collector. I'm currently conducting an appraisal of his collection." Gabrielle extended his hand. The letters Controllo were visible as Hauser shook it. "A pleasure," Gabrielle said, his voice carrying that characteristic softness. "The landscapes are excellent. The Lucieri in particular." Hauser blinked. "You know Lucieri? I know the value of things that are often overlooked." His eyes moved to Camilla as he said it, and the double meaning was so precise, so deliberate, that she felt it like a physical touch. The showing continued. Gabrielle moved through the exhibition with genuine interest, asking Camilla informed questions, engaging Hauser in discussion about the Neapolitan school with a depth of knowledge that visibly surprised the Swiss collector. By the end of the evening, Hauser had softened considerably, and Camilla had watched, with reluctant admiration, as Gabrielle dismantled the man's fear and replaced it with something approaching warmth. It was a performance, she told herself. Calculated charm deployed with strategic precision. But she had spent her professional life distinguishing the authentic from the counterfeit. And something in the way Gabrielle stood before the Lucieri landscape, a quiet, moody painting of the Bay of Naples at twilight, told her that his appreciation was not performed. It was real. After Hauser left, Camilla stood alone in the gallery, making notes on the evening's outcomes. The space was empty now, the paintings glowing softly on the white walls, the silence settling like dust. She heard his footstep and turned. Gabrielle was standing at the gallery's entrance, leaning against the doorframe. Marco was visible behind him, in the street, speaking quietly into his phone. The serpent tattoo was stark against Gabrielle's neck, the coils seeming to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat. "You didn't have to come tonight," she said. "No." Hauser was terrified. Hauser adjusted. He stepped into the gallery, and the space contracted around him. "People adjust to me. They always do. Is that what you expect me to do? Adjust?" He stopped. The distance between them was less than 3 feet. She could see the details of the serpent, each scale individually rendered. The eye of the snake positioned at the curve where his neck met his jaw, staring outward with a cold, patient intelligence that mirrored its bearer. "I don't expect anything from you," he said. "That's the problem. The problem. I have spent my entire life expecting people to behave in predictable ways. Fear, loyalty, self-interest, greed. Every person I have ever met has operated according to a logic I could identify and therefore control." He paused. The knuckles of his right hand, Silenzio, flexed slightly. "You don't operate according to any logic I can identify. You are not afraid of me. You are not trying to use me. You are not performing. And I cannot determine what you want. Maybe what I want isn't relevant to you. Everything about you is relevant to me." The words came out with a rawness that seemed to surprise even him. He stopped, looked away, the first time she had ever seen him break eye contact first, and when he looked back, the walls were up again, the composure restored. But she had seen behind them. Again. "I'll have the preliminary appraisal report delivered by Friday," she said quietly. He nodded. Then he turned and walked out of the gallery, and Marco fell into step beside him, and the black sedan materialized at the curb as if summoned by thought alone. Camilla locked the gallery, set the alarm, and walked home through the October streets of Naples. The city moved around her. Motor scooters, voices, the smell of coffee and garbage and sea salt, and she walked through it all without seeing any of it. She was thinking about the word everything. Everything about you is relevant to me. No one had ever said anything like that to her. Not with that weight. Not with that terrifying honesty. And the most frightening part, the part she could not process, could not categorize, could not file away in the orderly architecture of her emotional life, was that she believed him. 3 days later, everything changed. She was at her father's apartment in Posillipo for their Sunday visit. Enzo Ruggieri lived in four small rooms above a bakery. Surrounded by books he could no longer afford to buy and memories he could no longer afford to keep. He was 63, thin, with the kind of dignity that poverty sharpens rather than erodes. They ate together, a simple lunch of pasta and vegetables that Camilla had brought from the market. They talked about her work, about his garden boxes on the tiny balcony, about the weather. They did not talk about the past. They never talked about the past. But today, as Camilla was washing the dishes and her father was sitting in his worn armchair by the window, he said something that stopped her hands in the soapy water. "Someone came to see me this week." Camilla turned. "Who?" Her father's face was unreadable, the careful blankness of a man who had learned to conceal his emotions not through strength but through necessity. "A man named Ferretti. Marco Ferretti." The name hit her like cold water. "He said he represented someone who wanted to ensure my well-being. He said this person was aware of my circumstances. He offered money, a new apartment, medical care." Camilla's hands were shaking. She turned off the water and gripped the edge of the sink. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that my well-being was my own concern, that I have a daughter who provides for me, that I don't accept charity from strangers. And he left. Politely. A pause. But Camilla, he knew things. About our family. About what happened. Things I have never told anyone. Not even you." The silence in the small apartment was deafening. "Who is this person?" her father asked. "Who is the man Ferretti works for?" Camilla stared at the soap bubbles dissolving in the sink, and the world she had built. The careful, controlled, independent world that she had constructed brick by brick over 10 years, trembled on its foundation. "His name," she said, "is Gabriele Montoro." Her father's face collapsed. Not dramatically, subtly like a structure whose internal supports have just been removed. The blankness fractured, and what emerged beneath it was something Camilla had never seen on his face before. Not fear. Recognition. "Montoro," he whispered. "The Montoro boy. You know him?" "I knew his father." The words came out like stones. "Alfonso Montoro. He was the one. He was the reason." And then Enzo Ruggieri, broken, dignified, diminished, began to speak. And the story he told dismantled everything Camilla thought she knew about her life, her family, and the man whose gravity she had been orbiting for the past 6 weeks. 20 years ago, Enzo Ruggieri had managed financial operations for a consortium of families in Naples. He had been good at it, discreet, reliable, trustworthy. Among his clients was Alfonso Montoro, the head of the Montoro syndicate and father of a 13-year-old son named Gabriele. Alfonso had entrusted Enzo with a particular task, the management of a fund that existed outside the syndicate's official accounts. Personal fund. A fund that, Enzo eventually discovered, was earmarked for one purpose: to provide for Alfonso's wife, Maria, and their son in the event of Alfonso's death. Maria Montoro was a painter. She was gentle, artistic, entirely unsuited to the life her husband led. Alfonso loved her, or loved the idea of her, and the fund was his guarantee that she would be protected regardless of what happened to him. But Alfonso was also a man of limitless paranoia, and when a rival family began spreading rumors that his financial manager was skimming from the fund, Alfonso did not investigate. He did not ask questions. He acted. In a single week, Enzo Ruggieri's accounts were seized, his business relationships severed, his reputation destroyed. The evidence of skimming was fabricated, expertly, comprehensively fabricated, and by the time Enzo understood what was happening, it was too late. He was ruined. But that was not the worst of it. The worst of it was Maria. In the chaos of her husband's purge of his financial manager, Maria Montoro had tried to intervene. She had known Enzo was innocent, had known it with the certainty of a woman who paid attention to things her husband considered beneath his notice. She had argued with Alfonso. She had defended Enzo. And in doing so, she had triggered the very thing her husband feared most, the appearance of disloyalty. Alfonso did not harm her physically. He was not that kind of monster. But he dismantled her world with the same efficiency with which he had dismantled Enzo's. He removed her paintings. He isolated her from her friends. He installed the philosophy that would eventually be tattooed into his 14-year-old son's hands. Silence. Control. Maria Montoro died 6 months later. The official cause was illness. The real cause, as everyone who knew her understood, was erasure. Enzo finished speaking and sat very still in his chair, staring out the window at the narrow slice of bay visible between the buildings. Camilla stood at the sink, her hands white-knuckled on the porcelain edge, and the world rearranged itself around her. Gabrielle's father had destroyed her family. Gabrielle's father had destroyed his own wife. The same man, the same paranoia, the same philosophy etched into Gabrielle's skin before he was old enough to understand what it meant. And Gabrielle, the man who collected art to honor his dead mother, the man who had shown her his scars, the man who had said everything about you is relevant to me, Gabrielle knew. He knew who she was. He knew the connection between their families. He had sent Marco to her father's apartment. He had done research. He had planned. And he had not told her. She drove back to Naples in a state of controlled fury that felt remarkably similar to the composure she wore in professional settings. The only difference being that beneath it, everything was on fire. She went directly to her office. She pulled out the appraisal documents, the photographs, the notes from Ravello. She organized them into a folder with mechanical precision. Then she picked up her phone and called the number on the engagement letter. Marco answered on the second ring. "I need to see him," she said. "Tonight." A pause. She could hear Marco calculating, assessing, running scenarios. "He's at the estate in Ravello. Then I'll come to Ravello." Another pause. "I'll send a car." "Don't. I'll drive myself." She hung up before he could respond. The drive to Ravello took 90 minutes. She drove fast, the coastal road unreeling in the headlights like a ribbon of rage, the sea invisible but audible below the cliffs. A constant, rhythmic roaring that matched the sound inside her chest. She arrived at the estate at 10 in the evening. The gates opened as her car approached. He was expecting her. Of course he was expecting her. He anticipated everything. He controlled everything. He arranged the world according to his design and moved through it with the patient, coiling certainty of the serpent on his skin. Not tonight. She parked, walked to the entrance, and was met by Signora Valente, who took one look at her face and stepped aside without a word. She found him in the gallery. He was sitting in the leather chair by the window, a glass of wine on the table beside him, a book open in his lap. The gallery was lit softly, the museum-grade fixtures casting warm light on the paintings that lined the walls. The possible gentileschi glowed in its corner. The serpent tattoo was visible on his neck above the collar of his dark shirt. His forearms were bare, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and the continuation of the tattoo was fully exposed, the dark coils stark against his skin. His knuckles rested on the arm of the chair. Silenzio. Contrallo. He looked up when she entered. His expression did not change. But something in his eyes, something deep and guarded, shifted. "You spoke to your father," he said. "It was not a question. You sent Marco to his apartment." "Yes." You knew. From the beginning, from the gala, from the moment I walked into that room, you knew who I was. You knew what your father did to my family. You knew everything. He closed the book, set it aside. His movements were slow, deliberate, controlled. The knuckle tattoos caught the light as his hands settled on his thighs. Yes, he said again. Why? The word came out sharp, fractured, loaded with a fury she was barely containing. Why pursue me? Why the collection, the appraisal, the gallery, the conversations? Was it guilt? Strategy? Some elaborate form of… No. He stood. The motion was fluid, unhurried, but it changed the room's geometry entirely. Standing, he was 6'2", and the gallery suddenly felt smaller. The serpent tattoo moved with him, the coils shifting as the muscles of his neck adjusted, the snake's eye catching the light as he turned to face her fully. Then why? He looked at her. The coldness in his eyes was gone. What remained was something she had only glimpsed before, in fragments, in flashes, in the spaces between his carefully controlled words. It was vast and raw and terrifying, and it was directed entirely at her. Because when I walked into that room at the Ferrante Gala, and you stood there holding your clipboard and your expertise and your complete refusal to be intimidated by a room full of men who could end your career with a phone call. He paused. The knuckles of his right hand flexed. Silenzio. I recognized you. You recognized me? Not your name. Not your history. You. He took a step toward her. One step. The distance between them contracted. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who perform, who calculate, who measure every word and every gesture against what they might gain or lose. My father built a world based on silence and control, and I inherited it, and I have lived inside it for 19 years. And in all that time, all of it, I have never met a single person who was simply, completely, unapologetically real. His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Until you. Camilla felt the tears before she could stop them. Not tears of sadness, tears of fury, of confusion, of the unbearable collision between what she felt and what she knew. Your father destroyed my family, she said, and her voice broke on the last word. He fabricated evidence. He ruined my father. He killed your mother, maybe not with his hands, but he killed her all the same. And you carry his philosophy on your knuckles. Silence. Control. His words. His brand. Gabrielle flinched. It was barely visible. A tightening of the muscles around his eyes, a fractional pull of the jaw, but she saw it and she understood what it cost him. Yes, he said, and his voice was raw in a way she had never heard before. I carry them. I will carry them until the day I die. They are the first thing I see every morning and the last thing I see every night, and there has not been a single day, not one, when I have not looked at these hands and thought about what they represent. He held his hands up. Silenzio. Controllo. The ink was dark against his skin, the letters stark, permanent, inescapable. I was 14 years old. He held me down. He said I needed to remember, and I have remembered, every single day. But what I remember is not what he intended. His hands were shaking, minutely, almost imperceptibly, but shaking. I remember my mother crying in the next room. I remember the sound of the tattoo needle and the sound of her grief and understanding, even at 14, that they were connected. That his control, his silence, was not strength. It was violence. Invisible, systematic, total violence. He lowered his hands. I have spent my adult life trying to be something different from what he made me, and I have failed. Because no matter what I do, no matter how I try to change the machinery he built, I am still the head of the Montoro Syndicate. I still wear his marks. People still fear me. And when I look in the mirror, I see his face looking back. The gallery was silent. The paintings watched from their walls. Centuries of human expression frozen in pigment and oil, bearing witness to this moment as they had borne witness to so many others. And then I saw you, he said, standing in that room, holding your clipboard, refusing to be afraid. And for the first time in my life I thought, maybe there is something on the other side of all of this. Maybe there is a person who sees me. Not the name, not the tattoos, not the legend, but me. And maybe that person could. He stopped. The unfinished sentence hung in the air between them, more powerful than any completed thought could have been. Camilla stared at him. Her cheeks were wet. Her hands were clenched at her sides. Every instinct she had, every defense she had built, every wall she had erected, every rule she had established to keep herself safe and independent and untouchable, told her to walk away. She did not walk away. She stepped forward, closed the distance between them, and placed her hand flat against his chest. Beneath her palm, she could feel his heartbeat, fast, hard, completely at odds with the composure on his face. She could feel the serpent tattoo through the thin fabric of his shirt, the coils that extended from his neck across his shoulder and down into his torso. She could feel the heat of his skin. "I need time," she said. His hand came up slowly, achingly slowly, and covered hers. The knuckle tattoos pressed against the back of her fingers. Controllo. His grip was gentle. Gentler than she would have imagined possible from hands that had done the things his hands had done. "I'll wait," he said. She pulled her hand back, turned, walked out of the gallery, down the corridor, through the entrance, into the night air that smelled of lemons and salt. She drove home in silence, and the silence was louder than anything she had ever heard. What she did not see, what she could not have seen, was what happened after she left. Gabriel stood alone in the gallery for a long time. He did not move. He did not drink. He looked at his hands. Silenzio Controllo, and for the first time in his adult life, the man known as Il Serpente, the man who controlled an empire, the man who had never shown weakness to anyone. He pressed his knuckles against his forehead and closed his eyes, and something behind his face broke open like a dam, and the sound he made was not a word. It was the sound of a man who had just discovered that the walls he had spent his entire life building were not protecting him. They were entombing him. 2 weeks of silence followed. Camilla did not call. She did not return to the estate. She sent the completed appraisal report by courier, professional, thorough, impeccable, with no personal note attached. She confirmed the Gentileschi attribution through the infrared analysis in Rome, a discovery that under normal circumstances would have been the professional highlight of her career. She felt nothing about it. She visited her father twice during those 2 weeks. Both visits were strained, not because of anger between them, but because the revelation about the Montoro connection had opened a wound that neither of them knew how to treat. Enzo Ruggieri watched his daughter with the careful attention of a man who recognized the signs of emotional turmoil because he had spent 20 years living inside it. "You care about him," he said during the second visit. "Don't," she said. "Camilla. He's the son of the man who destroyed you. He's not his father." She looked at her father, this broken, dignified, diminished man who had every right to hate the Montoro name with the full force of his ruined life, and saw something in his eyes that she did not expect. Compassion. "I knew Maria," Enzo said quietly. "Gabrielle's mother. She came to our home once when you were very small. She brought you a doll. You won't remember." He paused. "She was the kindest person I have ever known. And Alfonso destroyed her because she defended me, because she told the truth." His voice was thick. "If her son has found his way to you, if he is trying to be something different from what his father made him, then perhaps that is Maria's legacy. Perhaps some part of her survived." Camilla left her father's apartment and sat in her car for 30 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing. That night, she dreamed about the serpent tattoo. In the dream, it was moving, uncoiling from Gabrielle's skin, sliding across the space between them, wrapping gently around her wrist. Not tightening, not threatening, just holding. She woke at 3 in the morning with her hand pressed against her wrist, feeling for coils that weren't there. The silence broke on a Tuesday. It did not break gently. Camilla was at a client meeting in the Vomero district, reviewing acquisition options for a corporate collection, when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. The message contained a photograph. It showed a document, a single page, typed, bearing a letterhead she recognized immediately. It was from the Montoro Syndicate's legal counsel, dated 3 months ago, before the gala, before any of it. The document was a directive authorizing the transfer of a substantial sum to a trust fund established in the name of Enzo Ruggieri. The sum was enough to purchase an apartment, provide a pension, cover medical care for life. The directive was signed at the bottom. The signature read, Gabriele Montoro. Below the photograph, a text message. He set this up months before he ever met you. Thought you should know. A friend. Camilla stared at the screen. 3 months before the gala. Before he had seen her hold a clipboard and refused to be afraid. Before any of it. He had been making amends to her father before he even knew she existed. Or had he? The contradiction tore at her. If he had set up the trust before the gala, it meant his interest in her father was independent of his interest in her. It meant the amends were genuine. Not a strategy to win her trust. Not a manipulation, but an authentic attempt to repair a harm his father had caused. But if the anonymous sender was trying to manipulate her, if this was part of a larger game she couldn't see, her phone buzzed again. A second message from the same number. Ask Marco. He'll confirm. She did not ask Marco. Instead, she drove to Ravello. The gates did not open this time. She pressed the intercom and waited. Signora Valente's voice came through the speaker, tight and strained. Signorina Ruggieri. Now is not a good time. Open the gate. A pause. Then the gate opened, and Camilla drove through and parked and walked toward the entrance with the focused determination of a woman who had stopped trying to control the narrative and had decided, instead, to walk directly into the center of it. What she found inside stopped her in her tracks. The entrance hall was occupied by 4 men she had never seen before, heavy, serious men with the unmistakable bearing of soldiers. Marco Ferretti stood near the staircase, his phone pressed to his ear, his face drawn with attention she had never seen on him. He saw Camilla and his eyes widened. You shouldn't be here, he said. What's happening? Marco ended his call and moved toward her quickly, positioning himself between her and the hallway that led deeper into the house. His body language was protective, not of Gabrielle, but of her. Vittorio Sana, Marco said low and fast. He made a move, challenged the Montoro holdings in Sardinia. It escalated. Sana's people made threats, specific threats, against anyone associated with the family. His eyes were hard. Including you. The blood drained from Camilla's face. Your name was on a list, Marco continued. We intercepted communication this morning. Sana's people have been watching you. Your office. Your father's apartment. He paused. Your father is safe. We moved him an hour ago. He's in a secure location. You moved my father? The boss ordered it. The moment the threat was identified. Camilla felt the floor shift beneath her. Where is he? Where is Gabrielle? Marco hesitated. In 9 years, he had never seen anyone ask for his boss with that particular urgency. The urgency not of business, but of something far more dangerous. Upstairs, he said. But Camilla, she was already moving. She found him in a room she hadn't seen before. A study, dark-paneled, lined with books, a desk at its center covered with documents and phones and the detritus of crisis management. He was standing behind the desk, his back to the door, staring out the window at the darkening coastline. He had removed his jacket. The dark shirt was untucked, the sleeves rolled past his elbows. The serpent tattoo was fully exposed. From the side of his neck, across the visible portion of his shoulder where the shirt had shifted, down both forearms, the coils dense and intricate against his skin. His hands were braced on the windowsill. Silenzio. Controllo. He turned when he heard her, and for the first time, she saw something on his face that she had never seen before. Fear. Not fear for himself. Fear for her. You shouldn't be here, he said, and his voice was hoarse, the softness stripped away, the control fraying at its edges. Camilla, you should not be here. Sana threatened me? Sana threatened everyone He stopped. The unfinished sentence again. The gap where the truth lived, too enormous and too terrifying to speak aloud. Everyone you what? He stared at her. The serpent on his neck seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. His hands were gripping the windowsill so tightly that the tendons stood out beneath the tattoo ink, the letters on his knuckles stretched taut. "Everyone I cannot afford to lose," he said, and the last wall between them crumbled like ash. The study was silent except for the distant sound of the sea and the muffled movement of Marco's people in the hallway below. The room felt sealed from the rest of the world. A glass jar capturing a moment that could not be repeated, could not be retrieved once it was over. Camilla stood just inside the doorway. Gabriel stood behind his desk, hands braced on the windowsill. The serpent tattoo coiled across his neck and forearms like a second skeleton. Visible, permanent, carrying every story his composed face refused to tell. The knuckle tattoos stretched taut against the wood. Silenzio, controllo, words his father had burned into him at 14. Words that had become, over 19 years, both his armor and his prison. "Everyone you cannot afford to lose," she repeated. Her voice was quieter than she intended. "Yes, I need you to say it properly." She stepped further into the room. "I need to hear you say it." He released the windowsill, turned to face her fully. In the low light of the study, with the coastline darkening behind him and the serpent's eye watching from the curve of his jaw, he looked like the man she had first imagined when she had read his profile, cold, dangerous, unreadable. But she knew better now. "You," he said. The single word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples that reached every wall. "I cannot afford to lose you." She crossed the room, stopped when there were 2 feet of space between them, that same charged distance they had maintained for weeks, the geography of something too large to approach directly. "The trust fund," she said. "For my father. You set it up 3 months before we met." Something moved across his face. A flash of something between guilt and relief. "How do you know that?" "Someone sent me documentation. A photo of the directive. Signed by you." She watched his face. "Was it Marco?" "Marco wouldn't." Pause. "Signora Valente, possibly. She has opinions about how I conduct myself. Despite everything. Despite the fear and the fury and the 2 weeks of silence and the earthquake that her father's story had set off inside her." Camilla almost smiled. "Your elderly housekeeper is managing your emotional life?" "She managed my mother's once." His voice was even, but his eyes were not. "She has been with this family for 40 years. She is the only person in my world who says what she thinks without calculating the consequences first." He paused. "Until recently." Camilla absorbed the meaning of that. She looked at his hands, at the knuckle tattoos that had haunted the edges of every scene between them, that had first appeared to her as symbols of power and had gradually, through every conversation and revelation, transformed into something else entirely. "Scars. Why did you set it up?" she asked. "Before you knew I existed. Before any of this." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. In the hallway, she could hear Marco issuing low, rapid instructions. Outside, the sea was beginning to move faster, an October wind coming in from the south, the kind that made the coastline sound like a living thing. "My father ruined Enzo Ruggieri based on a lie," Gabrielle said. "I discovered the truth when I was 22. I was going through old financial records, I had just taken over the syndicate, and I was auditing everything my father had built. The fabricated evidence was still in the files. My father had kept it. Documentation of his own crime, preserved with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything." His jaw tightened. "I think he kept it as a trophy. Proof that he had been decisive. That he had acted without sentiment." He moved away from the desk, and the space between them contracted slightly. "I investigated Ruggieri independently. Found him in Posillipo. A man who had managed millions, living above a bakery, working as a bookkeeper." His voice was flat, controlled, the flatness of someone who had spent years learning to narrate unbearable things without breaking. "My father had destroyed an innocent man to protect a fund that was meant to protect my mother. And then he destroyed my mother anyway. The logic was so perfectly, catastrophically senseless that I couldn't process it for months." He stopped 2 feet from her. The serpent tattoo was close enough now that she could see the individual scales in the coils at his neck, the precision of the artistry, the permanence of it. "So I set up the trust. Quietly. through 3 intermediaries so that Ruggieri would never know where it came from. I had no intention of having it discovered. No expectation of, he paused, anything. It was not strategy. It was not charity. It was the only form of restitution I could make without making the past visible, without forcing a man who had survived his own destruction to relive it for my benefit. Camilla felt the tears again. Quieter this time, less furious, rising from somewhere much deeper. And then, he continued, I walked into a room in the Grand Hotel Meridiana, and a woman in an ivory dress was holding a clipboard and correcting my assessment of a bronze she knew more about than anyone else in the building, and I thought, the ghost of that half-smile, the one she had first seen at the gala, I thought, God, she's real. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had been building between them for 6 weeks, every conversation and confrontation and carefully maintained distance. Gabrielle, she said, and it was the first time she had used his name. His eyes changed, a flicker of something raw and immediate. I know, he said. I know what I am. I know what this world is. I know that no woman with any wisdom should. I know who you are, she said. And I know what you are. And I know what your father did to mine, and to your mother, and to you. She met his eyes fully. And I am standing in this room anyway. The study was completely still. He reached up slowly, with the hand bearing silenzio across the knuckles, and touched her face. Not the way he had at the Fondazione, hovering near her hair with a question. He touched her face. His thumb brushed along her cheekbone with a gentleness that was breathtaking from hands that could do what his could do. She turned her face slightly into his palm. Just slightly, the smallest possible surrender. His eyes closed for 1 second. When they opened, the coldness that the world knew, the calculating distance that had earned him his reputation and his alias, was gone. What was behind it was enormous, and frightened, and entirely devastatingly human. I have no idea how to do this, he said quietly. Neither do I, she said. Below them, Marco's footsteps moved through the house. The sea wind picked up outside. The serpent on Gabrielle's neck was still, patient, watching. But for the first time in all the weeks she had known him, the coils did not seem threatening. They seemed like what they were. A story, inked permanently into the skin of a man who had been carrying it alone for 19 years. She reached up and placed her hand against his chest again, as she had in the gallery. His heartbeat was the same. Fast, hard, completely unguarded. His forehead descended toward hers. Slowly, with the deliberate control that governed every movement he made, except that this time the control was not distance, it was reverence. Their foreheads touched. They stood like that, not kissing, not moving, simply present in the same breath of air, and the room around them ceased to be a crisis command center in the middle of a territorial war and became, for that moment, exactly what it was. The place where 2 people who had spent their entire lives in different kinds of armor had, simultaneously, removed it. The crisis with Sana required the next 72 hours to resolve. Camilla stayed at the estate. Not because she was told to, no one told Camilla Ruggieri anything, but because she chose to. Her father was safe in a location Marco had arranged. A quiet villa outside Sorrento belonging to a family allied with the Montoro name. She called him twice daily. He sounded oddly, better than he had in years, calmer, less compressed, as though the disruption had paradoxically released him from the weight of his ordinary existence. The estate became a different kind of environment over those 72 hours. Marco ran the tactical response from the ground floor. Phones, meetings, coded conversations that Camilla chose not to overhear. 2 additional security personnel appeared without explanation and took positions at the gates. Signora Valente kept the house fed and orderly with the imperturbable efficiency of a woman who had weathered more crises than most generals. Camilla worked. She set up at the desk in the library, a room adjacent to the gallery that smelled of old paper and beeswax, and continued her professional life with the determined normalcy that was her most consistent character trait. She had 3 other clients whose commissions were ongoing. She drafted correspondence, reviewed documentation, prepared analysis notes. She was good at existing inside difficulty without collapsing. Gabrielle noticed. She would look up from her work and find him in the doorway. Not speaking, not intruding, just present. Checking. The serpent tattoo above his collar, the knuckle tattoos visible as his hands rested on the doorframe. Controllo. And in his eyes, every time, that quiet ferocity that she had learned to recognize as the only form of tenderness he knew how to express directly. On the second evening, he brought her wine and sat across from her at the library table, and they talked for 4 hours. Not about Sana. Not about the crisis. About everything else. She told him about Bologna, about the conservation lab where she had learned to see painting at a cellular level, about the professor who had told her she had the most precise eye he had encountered in 40 years of teaching. She told him about the year she had spent rebuilding her confidence after her family's collapse, about how she had decided that no man, no family, no system would ever again have the power to determine the dimensions of her life. He listened the way he did everything, completely without distraction, with that absolute attention that felt like being the only thing in the world worth looking at. He told her about Switzerland, about the school that had expelled him, the real reason, which was that he had attacked a boy of 17 who had been systematically bullying a smaller child for months, and that he had done so in the school's front hallway during a formal assembly, with complete calm and devastating efficiency, and had not expressed a single word of remorse when called before the headmaster. "Why weren't you remorseful?" she asked. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because remorse is only genuine if you wish you'd made a different choice." "I didn't." "That's the most Gabrielle Montoro answer possible," she said. He looked at her. That slight shift at the corner of his mouth that she had learned to recognize as his version of a full smile, and said, "You've started verbing my name. You've started being a verb," she said. The 4 hours dissolved, and then it was past midnight, and the library was warm with lamplight and the sound of the sea, and Signora Valente appeared, looked at them both with an expression of profound self-satisfaction, and told them that the guest room had been prepared. On the third day, Sana capitulated. Marco delivered the news mid-morning with the brisk efficiency of a man reporting a weather forecast. The Sardinian boss had overextended himself. The territorial challenge was the product of overconfidence fueled by bad intelligence and worse wine. When Gabrielle's response had demonstrated not aggression but comprehensive, suffocating strategic pressure, access routes closed, supply chains interrupted, allied families systematically reminded of their obligations. Sana had retreated with the speed of a man who had finally understood how badly he had miscalculated. The threat to Camilla was neutralized. The threat to her father was neutralized. The crisis was over. Marco stood in the entrance hall and delivered all of this and then looked at Gabrielle and then looked at Camilla and then looked at the ceiling briefly, as if seeking guidance. "I'll arrange the car to take Signorina Ruggieri back to Naples," he said. "No," Gabrielle said. His voice was quiet, absolute. Marco looked at him. "I'll take her." Marco's expression underwent a series of rapid internal calculations. In 9 years, Gabrielle Montoro had never personally driven anyone anywhere. He had drivers. He had vehicles. He had logistics. He did not drive. "You'll." "Thank you, Marco. You can stand down for the afternoon." Marco stood down. They drove along the coastal road in Gabrielle's personal car. A dark, quiet machine that suited him perfectly, with the windows cracked and the October air coming off the sea. He drove the way he did everything. Precisely, completely in control, with an ease that came from total competence rather than any attempt to appear casual. Camilla watched the coastline. The water was bright today. The storm had passed overnight, and the sea had settled into a brilliant, sharp blue that looked almost aggressive in its clarity. "What happens now?" she asked. He kept his eyes on the road. The serpent tattoo climbed his neck above the collar of his jacket, the coils patient and still against his skin. His hands were relaxed on the wheel. Silenzio. Controllo. The letters faced upward in the morning light. "That depends," he said. "On what?" He glanced at her. The cold eyes were warm today, or rather, she understood now that they had always been warm, and that the coldness was a language he had learned because warmth in his world had always been weaponized. "On whether you're willing to let me show you what this looks like when I try to do it right," he said. "I will get things wrong. I am not built for the simplicity of ordinary things. I have never had to be. And there are parts of this world I cannot remove myself from quickly or cleanly. But I can work toward it. I can choose, I have been choosing, in ways you didn't see, for the past year, to build something different. He paused. I want you in that something different. She turned back to the sea. You could have told me about my father, about what you knew from the beginning. Yes. Why didn't you? A long pause, long enough that the coastline changed around them. A sweeping curve, the town of Vietri-sur-Mer coming into view on the hillside above. Because I was afraid, he said. For the first time in my adult life, I was afraid of something that had nothing to do with power or survival. I was afraid that if you knew the connection immediately, you would never let yourself see me. You would see only my father's name. He was right. She knew he was right, and the knowledge was uncomfortable. And now? She asked. Now you know everything. And you're still in this car. She was still in the car. Naples appeared on the horizon, sprawling and magnificent and chaotic. The city climbing the hills above the bay with the architectural ambition of a place that had never fully accepted its own limitations. Camilla watched it approach and thought about distance. The distance between where she had been 6 weeks ago, alone and armored and self-sufficient, and where she was now. The distance was not as great as she had imagined. She was still alone in the ways that mattered. She was still armored. She was still self-sufficient. But there was a door now in one of the walls that had not been there before. And on the other side of it was a man who drove a car with serpent coils visible above his collar and knuckle tattoos reading Silenzio and Contrallo, and who was trying imperfectly, awkwardly, with all the graceless sincerity of someone who had never tried before, to be something other than what his father had made him. She thought about Maria Montoro, who had come to her family's home when Camilla was very small and brought her a doll. She thought about Artemisia Gentileschi's Judith, the steady focus of a woman doing what needed to be done. She thought about the serpent in the gallery at Ravello, coiling through the leather chair where Gabrielle had sat watching her, and the serpent in her dream, wrapping gently around her wrist. Not tightening, just holding. I'll need time, she said again. I told you. I'll wait. You can stop waiting, she said. I just need it not to happen all at once. He exhaled, a slow, controlled release that was, she understood, his version of profound relief. I can manage that, he said quietly. They did not rush. The weeks that followed were a careful, deliberate construction, built not on grand gestures but on the accumulation of ordinary moments that, because of who they were and what they had come from, were not ordinary at all. He came to her exhibitions. Not conspicuously. He was not a man designed for obscurity, but present, engaged, genuinely interested in the work she was presenting. He asked questions that revealed the depth of his art historical knowledge and occasionally made connections she hadn't considered, and the first time this happened, she had looked at him across a room full of collectors and critics and felt a pride so sharp it startled her. She came to the estate at Ravello more often. They continued their conversations about art, about philosophy, about history, and the conversations were increasingly less about the subjects themselves and more about the people having them, their histories, their instincts, the ways they were alike and the ways they were not. She visited her father regularly, and gradually Enzo Ruggieri's resistance to the Montoro name softened. Not because he forgave what had been done, but because he was a man of sufficient intelligence to understand that children are not their parents, and that the act of amends has its own moral weight independent of the harm that necessitated it. Gabrielle and her father met once, about a month after the sauna crisis. It was brief, precise, and conducted in Camilla's office because she had insisted on neutral ground. The two men regarded each other with the careful attention of people who shared a history they had not chosen, and when Enzo Ruggieri extended his hand, Gabrielle took it with both of his, the knuckle tattoos visible against the old man's skin, and said, I cannot repair what my father did. I can only tell you that I know the cost of it, and that for what it's worth, it was not paid for nothing. He glanced at Camilla. It brought me here. Enzo looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he said, Take care of her. She is more fragile than she allows anyone to see. I know, Gabrielle said. Camilla, who was not fragile and had never been fragile and objected to being described as fragile, opened her mouth to say so. Gabrielle caught her eye across the room and the corner of his mouth shifted, barely, and she closed her mouth. Afterward, She told him that her father was wrong. He's not entirely wrong, Gabrielle said. You're not fragile, but you are careful. And carefully maintained strength isn't the same as invulnerability. You protect your interior more fiercely than anyone I have ever met. You're one to talk, she said. Exactly, he said, which is why I can recognize it. It was on a Friday evening in November. Cold, the bay shining gray under a low sky, the city wrapped in the particular melancholy that November brings to places that have survived too much history, that the landscape between them shifted again. Camilla had been working late, finalizing a major acquisition proposal for a client in Milan. She was tired, not the ordinary tiredness of effort, but the deeper fatigue of someone who had been managing an excess of emotional content for 2 months and had not given herself enough space to simply exist. Gabrielle had texted in the early evening, "The estate, tonight if you want. No agenda." She had driven to Ravello. The house was quiet when she arrived, quieter than usual. Marco was absent. Signora Valente had left food in the kitchen and disappeared. Only 2 security personnel were visible, and they acknowledged her arrival with nods and did not follow her inside. He was in the gallery, as she might have expected. Sitting in the leather chair, no book this time, no glass of wine. Just sitting in the soft light, looking at the possible gentileschi. The serpent tattoo was visible above the collar of his dark shirt. His forearms were bare, the coils extending down his wrists, the knuckle tattoos resting on the arm of the chair. Silenzio, controllo. But his posture was different, unfamiliar. He looked tired, not the tiredness of sleeplessness. She had seen that in the crisis days, the controlled exhaustion of a man who ran on discipline when biology insisted otherwise. This was something else. The tiredness of a person who had been holding something heavy for a very long time and had momentarily forgotten why. She sat on the floor beside his chair, not in a chair of her own. On the floor, her back against the chair's leather arm, close enough that her shoulder was touching his knee. He looked down at her. The serpent's eye watched from the curve of his jaw. The gallery was warm and quiet around them. "Tell me something that isn't true," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I am completely fine. Tell me something that is." A longer pause. The gallery held its breath. "I am exhausted," he said. "Not from the work. From being this." He gestured at himself. A small, encompassing gesture. "This version of myself. The version that knows how to handle everything. The version that never missteps. The version that," he stopped. The knuckles of his right hand tightened briefly. "Silenzio. My father made me into something efficient. And I have been efficient for 19 years. And some days I am very, very tired of it." Camilla reached up and took his hand. She turned it over, palm up, the knuckle tattoos facing downward, the letters hidden against her fingers. She held it in her lap. He didn't move. He barely breathed. "You don't have to be efficient tonight," she said. He looked at their joined hands for a long moment. His thumb moved, slowly, carefully, across the back of her hand. A small, almost tentative motion. "I don't know what I am without it," he said. "I think you do," she said. "I think the man who bought this collection and set up a trust fund for a man he had never met and drove me to Naples and sat in the back of a room and laughed because a woman said something honest. I think that man knows exactly who he is without the efficiency. He's just afraid that person isn't enough." The gallery was perfectly still. "Is he?" Gabrielle asked, and his voice was so stripped of everything, every layer of control and composure and cultivated authority, that she felt the question land directly in the center of her chest. She turned to look at him. Their faces were close, him in the chair, her on the floor, their heads at nearly the same level. The serpent tattoo was inches from her eyes, the coils patient, the serpent's gaze steady. "Yes," she said. "He is more than enough." His eyes closed, just briefly. When they opened, they were wet, the faintest gloss immediately controlled, but she saw it. She was the only person who would ever have seen it. He reached down and pulled her up from the floor with a careful, deliberate motion. Not roughly, not urgently, with the same controlled precision that characterized everything he did, except that the control here was in service of gentleness rather than power. She stood, and they were face to face, and the distance between them was nothing at all. He put his arms around her, slowly, as if the motion required the same courage as walking into a war. She let herself be held. It was, for both of them, an entirely new country. She buried her face against the warmth of his throat, against the serpent tattoo, against the story inked permanently into his skin. She could feel the coils beneath her cheek, the raised texture of the tattoo, the warmth of his pulse beneath it. His arms were around her with a careful, almost reverent strength that told her exactly what she had known for weeks. He was terrified of holding something and not knowing how to keep it safe. "I've got you," she said, because it needed to be said. He tightened his hold, and the gallery was warm and quiet, and the sea was gray outside the windows, and the Gentileschi watched from its corner, and the night deepened around them with the slow, absolute certainty of something that had been inevitable since the first moment. It was not the night of surrender. It was the night of arrival. They did not rush. The evening moved at the pace of people who had finally accepted that they had time, that the urgency that had characterized every interaction until now was not the product of necessity but of fear, and that the fear was dissolving. They sat together in the gallery and talked until past midnight, not about the past or the complicated architecture of their family's histories, but about the future, what she wanted from her work, what he was trying to build from the wreckage of his inheritance. The kind of ordinary life neither of them had ever lived and both of them, quietly, desperately wanted. He told her he had been working for 2 years with legal counsel to begin divesting the syndicate's less legitimate operations, redirecting capital into legitimate enterprise, building exit routes from the shadow economy that his father had made his life's work. It was slow. It was dangerous. It required the patience of the serpent and the precision of the connoisseur. "How long?" she asked. 3 years, minimum. Perhaps 5. It cannot be done in a way that destabilizes the people whose livelihoods depend on the legitimate operations. And it cannot be done in a way that signals weakness to the families who would move into any vacuum immediately. He paused. "But it can be done. I have made sure of it." "Why?" she asked. "Before me, before any of this. Why were you already doing it?" He looked at the Gentileschi, Judith with her steady, focused expression, the woman doing what needed to be done. "Because my mother painted," he said simply, "and I wanted to live in a world where that was enough." Camilla stayed that night, in the guest room, Signora Valente's prepared guest room, because they were 2 adults navigating something real rather than something rushed, and real things deserved patience. But before she went to her room, she stood with him in the gallery doorway, and he held her face in both hands, the knuckle tattoos against her cheeks, Silenzio on one side and Controllo on the other, and both of them ineffectual against the warmth of what was happening between them, and he pressed his lips to her forehead. Not her mouth, her forehead, with a tenderness so specific, so deliberate, so free of any agenda, that it undid her more completely than anything else could have. She pressed her hand once against his chest, felt his heartbeat, steady now, slower than it had ever been in her presence. Then she went to her room, and he remained in the gallery, and the house settled into the particular silence of a place where something fundamental had just shifted, permanently, irrevocably, like a tectonic plate completing a long, slow movement that had been underway for years. The weeks that followed were a different kind of story. They were not without difficulty. Gabrielle's world was not designed for the kind of openness that genuine intimacy required, and the habits of 19 years did not dissolve cleanly. There were moments when his walls came back. Moments when pressure from the syndicate or external threats made him retreat into the efficiency and silence his father had installed. And Camilla would find herself looking at a man who was wearing a face that wasn't his, speaking in a voice that wasn't his, and she would have to decide each time whether to push against the wall or wait for it to come down on its own. She pushed, not forcefully, not with the aggressive confrontation that would trigger every defensive instinct he had, but with the patient, meticulous persistence of someone who understood that authenticated truth requires sustained attention. She would ask him questions, specific questions about what he was feeling or thinking or fearing, the kind of direct, unapologetic curiosity that no one in his life had ever applied to him. And every time the wall would crack, not crumble, crack. And through the crack, the real man would emerge, raw-edged and often inarticulate and entirely genuine. He, in turn, learned her walls. They were fewer and less obvious than his, but they existed, particularly around her family's history, around her mother's abandonment, around the years of rebuilding that she had framed as strength because the alternative framing required her to acknowledge how much she had been hurt. "You describe everything you survived as a choice," he said once, lying on the gallery floor beside her. They had taken to lying on the floor sometimes in the evenings, looking up at the ceiling, the paintings watching from the walls. His forearm was beside hers, the serpent's coils visible in the lamplight. "Every loss, every hardship, you say you chose to rebuild. You chose to make yourself indispensable. You chose not to rely on anyone." "I did choose those things," she said. "You did. But you didn't choose to need them. That happened to you." He turned his head to look at her. The serpent's eye was level with her face at this angle, patient, observant, watching. "You are allowed to admit that things happened to you that you would not have chosen." She stared at the ceiling for a long time. "So are you," she finally said. He exhaled, reached over, took her hand and held it the way she had held his that first real night. Palm up, knuckle tattoos facing down, the letters hidden. "I know," he said. December came, and with it the particular gravity of the end of a year, the way December makes everything feel both summarized and unresolved. Camilla's professional life was exceptionally busy. End-of-year acquisitions, institutional reviews, the annual rush of collectors who needed authentication and appraisal before January's tax filings. She worked long hours and managed multiple projects simultaneously and maintained the professional reputation she had spent years building. But the hours she was not working were different now. They were not solitary. It was 10 days before Christmas when the thing with Luca Ferraro happened. Luca was an architect, handsome, charming, with the easy confidence of a man who had grown up in wealth and worn it lightly. He was a client of one of Camilla's colleagues and had been introduced at an event. He had asked for her card. She had given it professionally. He had called 3 times under the pretext of seeking consultation on art acquisition for a property he was developing. She had not mentioned him to Gabrielle. There was nothing to mention. He was a professional contact, a non-event, except that he wasn't non-existent to Gabrielle. She learned this on a Wednesday evening at a dinner that had been arranged by mutual contacts. A small gathering at a restaurant in the Chiaia district. Luca Ferraro was there, and 15 minutes after she and Gabrielle arrived together, she watched Gabrielle see the way Ferraro looked at her. The temperature in the room did not change. Gabrielle's expression did not change. He continued his conversation with the host with impeccable courtesy. His voice soft, his posture relaxed. The serpent tattoo was visible above his collar. His hands were around a glass. Silenzio, controllo. But something had changed. Camilla could feel it the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure. Not see it, not hear it, just feel it in some animal part of yourself that recognizes danger before the mind catches up. He was very still. Later, when Ferraro crossed the room toward her with a smile engineered for maximum effect, Gabrielle simply moved. 1 step, positioned himself beside her. Not in front of her, not blocking her, but beside her. His hand came to rest at the small of her back, the lightest possible touch, the knuckle tattoos at the edge of her vision. It was not possessive. It was declarative. Said, "She is not unaccompanied." Ferraro's smile adapted with the flexibility of a man who read rooms well. He greeted her with professional warmth, acknowledged Gabrielle with the careful deference of someone who recognized what he was looking at, and excused himself within 2 minutes. Afterward, in the car, Camilla looked at Gabrielle. "That was unnecessary," she said. "Perhaps. I can manage Luca Ferraro." "I know you can." "Then why?" "Because," he said, his voice even softer than usual, "I am not entirely past 19 years of operating according to the principle that the things you value require active protection. I am working on it." He glanced at her. The serpent tattoo shifted above his collar as he turned. "I will do better." She believed him, and the fact that he had acknowledged it, had identified the behavior and named it and committed to doing better without defensiveness, was, in its own way, more intimate than anything else. "You will," she said, and put her hand on his forearm, over the serpent's coils, and the conversation was complete. January arrived, and with it, a disruption Camilla had not anticipated. A journalist, one of those persistent, ambitious types who fed on the intersection of high society and organized crime, published a piece that named Camilla as a close associate of Gabriel Montoro. The piece was careful enough to avoid specific accusations, but the implications were unmistakable. She was connected to the syndicate, her business potentially a vehicle for money laundering, her professional reputation a convenient cover for criminal interests. It was, from a professional standpoint, devastating. 3 clients suspended their commissions pending review. 2 institutions declined to confirm scheduled engagements. The phone calls from colleagues were sympathetic but cautious, the cautiousness of people who understood that association with certain names had a radius of consequence. Camilla sat in her office on the afternoon the piece appeared and experienced, for the first time since she was 17 years old, the feeling that the thing she had built was crumbling. She did not call Gabrielle immediately. She sat with it for 2 hours, which was her way of processing, sitting with the full weight of something without rushing to resolution. Then she called him. He was at the estate when his phone rang. Marco later told her that he had read the article 3 hours before she called and had been standing at the gallery window ever since, the serpent tattoo in full view of the afternoon light, the knuckle tattoos against the glass. He answered on the first ring. "I know," he said. "It could end my career," she said. "Even if every claim is wrong, the association alone. It won't. You don't know that. I know who placed the story." His voice was very quiet, dangerously quiet, the softness that everyone in his world had learned to recognize not as calm but as the moment before resolution. It was Sana, his final play before his complete withdrawal from the Neapolitan market. He couldn't touch you physically, so he tried to touch what you've built. Camilla was silent for a moment. "How do you know it was him?" "Because I had already anticipated it. Because when you make the kind of enemies I have made, you learn to think 3 steps ahead." A pause. "Because I have contacts in every publication in this city and country who owe me information, and the information came through within 4 hours of the piece appearing. And I have already prepared a full dossier, documented proof that every claim in that article is false, that your business has passed independent financial audits across 5 years, and that the journalist in question has a track record of paid fabrication on behalf of syndicate rivals." He paused again. "It will be delivered to the publication's editorial board and 3 national press regulatory bodies by tomorrow morning." Camilla pressed her hand flat on her desk, her beautiful, orderly desk, surrounded by her reference books and her authentication files and the accumulated evidence of the career she had built by herself and for herself. "You prepared this before I called," she said. "Yes. You had it ready." "I protect what matters to me," he said. "That is something I intend to keep doing. Better and more carefully and with your explicit knowledge rather than behind your back. But yes, always." She thought about Judith, the steady focus of a woman doing what needed to be done. She thought about the serpent, patient, watching, knowing when to move and when to be still. "Gabrielle," she said. "Yes. Thank you." The silence on the line was the warm kind. The documentation was delivered as promised. The publication issued a correction within 48 hours. 3 of the clients reinstated their commissions within the week. The institutional engagements were confirmed by the 2nd week. The journalist was the subject of a press regulatory complaint that would take months to resolve but would define the limits of his future reach. Sana, it emerged, had made 1 move too many. The intelligence that had been gathered during the crisis had served as leverage with 3 allied families, and his Sardinian operations were now under pressure from every direction simultaneously. It was, Marco noted with characteristic brevity, a complete and final self-destruction. "He did it to himself," Marco said, sitting across from Camilla in the estate kitchen one afternoon, while Signora Valente moved around them with the efficiency of someone who had long since decided that this woman was a permanent fixture and adjusted the domestic logistics accordingly. "The boss just accelerated the timeline." "The boss usually does," Camilla said. Marco looked at her with the careful assessment he had applied to her since their first encounter, that cataloging attention, that soldier-accountant evaluation. And then, for the first time, something in his expression changed. Softened. "For what it's worth," he said. "I've worked for him for 9 years. I have never seen him." He stopped. Started again. "He is a different person around you. Not soft. Not compromised. Just real." He paused. "I think his mother would have liked you." Camilla looked at the serpent visible on Marco's boss's neck in the doorway beyond the kitchen, where Gabrielle was just entering from the garden, the January light sharp behind him. "I think I would have liked her," she said. It was a Sunday in February. Cold, the bay steel gray, the city stripped of tourists and softened by the low winter light, when Gabrielle Montoro did the thing that no one who knew him would have predicted, and that the woman who knew him best would spend the rest of her life recognizing as the most profoundly deliberate act of his life. They were in the gallery at Ravello. Evening. The heaters hummed softly. The paintings glowed in the museum-grade light. The possible Gentileschi, now confirmed, the attribution signed off by 2 independent scholars and the documentation submitted to the artist's official catalog committee. Hung at the far end of the room, Judith with her steady focus, more luminous than it had been before, as if the authentication had given it permission to be fully itself. Camilla was standing in front of it, her favorite place in the estate, possibly her favorite place in the world, though she would not have admitted that easily. She was thinking about the painting in the way she thought about things she loved, attending to its details not as a professional exercise but as a form of communion. The way Judith's hand held the sword, not tightly, not with the death grip of effort, but with the easy competence of someone who had made their decision and was fully at peace with it. She heard him behind her, felt the room change. She turned. He was not standing. He was kneeling, not on both knees, on one. The posture of a man who had made a choice and was presenting the evidence of it with his body, with the same literal, physical directness that had always characterized the most honest moments between them. The serpent tattoo was fully visible, climbing his neck, across his shoulder, extending down his forearms where his sleeves were pushed back. The knuckle tattoos faced upward as he held something toward her. Silenzio on the left, Controllo on the right. In his hands was a ring. Simple, beautiful, exactly right. A narrow band of gold with a single diamond, small and perfect, like a period at the end of a sentence that had taken a very long time to reach completion. He was not performing. He was not smiling the careful half-smile of a man in control of his presentation. His face was entirely, devastatingly open. The walls down, the depth behind his eyes fully visible, every layer of composure stripped away to reveal the man beneath. Frightened, sincere, and more present than she had ever seen him. "I am not good at this," he said. His voice was the softest she had ever heard it, barely above the room's ambient sound. "I have never done this. I have never asked for anything from anyone that I wasn't completely certain I deserved to receive. And I do not know if I deserve this." He looked at the ring in his hands. Silenzio. Controllo. At the tattoos his father had burned into him at 14 as a reminder that sentiment was weakness. "But I know that I have spent 19 years being what my father made me, and the past 6 months trying to become something else. And I know that the difference between those 2 versions of myself, the only meaningful difference, is you." He looked up at her. "Not because you fixed me. Not because you made me better by some miraculous intervention. But because you see me as I actually am, and you are still here, and that is—" His voice stopped, just for a moment, just long enough for her to see that he had reached the limit of his language, that what he was trying to say was larger than the words he had available. "I want to be worthy of it," he said. "I want to spend the rest of my life being worthy of it. With you. If you will let me." The gallery was perfectly still. Judith watched from the wall. The serpent coiled across his skin. Camilla looked at the man on one knee before her, this controlled, dangerous, deeply wounded, genuinely trying man, and felt every version of what she might have felt in this moment. Fear. Uncertainty. The pull of her independence, the voice that said this is too much, this is too complicated, this world is not yours. She felt all of it. And then she looked at his hands. At Silenzio and Controllo, at the scars his father had made, at the hands that had held her with such deliberate gentleness, that had moved a strand of hair with a question, that had touched her face the way you touch something you are afraid of losing, and she stepped forward. She took the ring from his hands and she held it for a moment and she looked at it, the way she looked at everything she was trying to authenticate, tending to it, finding the truth of it. Then she held out her hand. He exhaled, a long, shaking release of everything he had been holding. Then his fingers, silenzio controllo, slid the ring onto her hand with the careful, reverent precision of a man who understood that some things, once placed, are not to be removed. He stood. She was crying. He was not quite, though his eyes were bright and his jaw was tight with the effort of controlling something enormous. She put her hands on his face, her ring catching the gallery light, the diamond small and certain, and she looked at him for a long moment. At all of it. The serpent, the tattoos, the cold eyes that were not cold, the history carved into every surface of him. "You are already worthy of it," she said. "You have been for longer than you know." He kissed her. Not the forehead this time. Not tentative, not managed, not controlled by the discipline of restraint. A real kiss, warm and careful and completely honest. The first truly honest thing either of them had done in front of another living soul in longer than they could remember. The serpent tattoo moved against her fingers as his hands came to either side of her face, and the gallery held them both with the same patient attention it had always given to the authentic things it contained. Behind the doorway, Signora Valente, who had, it would later emerge, been standing in the corridor for the past 3 minutes, turned away, clasped her hands together, looked at the ceiling, and expressed a single word in a voice too quiet to be heard by anyone but herself. "Finally," she said. Marco Ferretti, waiting in the entrance hall, heard footsteps in the corridor above and then silence, and then a sound that he had heard perhaps 3 times in 9 years. His boss's laugh, real and unguarded and entirely himself. Marco sat down on the nearest chair, pressed his fingers against his eyes, and took a very long breath. Then he sent a text to 3 trusted contacts that read simply, "Threat level is now 0. Stand down." They stood in the gallery for a long time after. Not talking, just present. Her head against his chest, his arms around her, the serpent tattoo beneath her cheek warm and alive, the ring on her finger, catching fragments of the gallery's light. The Gentileschi watched from the wall. Judith with her steady focus, her quiet competence, her peace. "What happens now?" Camilla asked, as she had asked once before on the coastal road. He pressed his lips to her hair. "Now," he said, "we build the something different." "On which timeline?" "Ours," he said. In the months that followed, the something different took shape. Slowly, carefully, with the patience of 2 people who understood that authentic things cannot be rushed. The syndicate's legitimate operations expanded. The shadow economy elements contracted. Gabrielle worked with the methodical, serpentine patience that had always defined him, not urgently, not visibly, but with the deep strategic intelligence that had made him one of the most formidable men in Southern Europe, now redirected toward construction rather than maintenance of power. It was not without difficulty. There were nights when the pressure of the process, the resistance of certain factions, the legal complexities, the ongoing work of managing relationships with allied families while gradually disengaging from their more dangerous dependencies, brought him to the estate's garden in the early hours, and Camilla would wake and find him gone, and she would get up and find him there, the serpent tattoo pale in the moonlight, the knuckle tattoos against the stone railing. She would stand beside him, not talking, just present, and he would turn and look at her, and something in his face would settle. "Come inside," she would say, and he would. Enzo Ruggieri moved into a small house in Posillipo, not the apartment above the bakery, but a proper house with a garden, purchased through the trust that had been set up 3 years ago and that Camilla had, after considerable internal argument, decided to accept on his behalf on the grounds that it was restitution rather than charity and that her father deserved a garden. He grew tomatoes. He read. He visited them at the estate monthly, and Signora Valente treated him with the particular warmth she reserved for people she had decided were essential, and he became, gradually and quietly, the father figure that Gabrielle had never had. The morning of the wedding was bright. A May morning, the bay blue and brilliant, the lemon groves of the estate in full bloom, the air carrying the complex sweetness that the Amalfi Coast produces in May as if as an act of deliberate beauty. They married in the estate's garden. Small ceremony, 20 people, the people who were real. Marco, who had requested permission to give a toast and then, when permission was granted, discovered that he had written nothing because some things, he said, resisting the urge to clear his throat unsuccessfully, were self-evidently complete and did not require annotation. Senora Valente, who wore a dress she had purchased 30 years ago for a wedding she had attended as a young woman, and which had been waiting in a wardrobe ever since for the right occasion. Enzo Ruggieri, who walked his daughter through the garden toward the man waiting at the end of it, and who pressed her hand once before releasing it, and whose expression contained, for the first time in 20 years, something uncomplicated. He was happy. Simply, cleanly happy. Gabrielle stood in the morning light in a dark suit. Tailored, perfect, exactly right, with his collar open, the serpent tattoo visible along his neck, the scales catching the May light. His hands were at his sides, the knuckle tattoos visible as they always were. Silenzio, controllo, his father's words, carved into him at 14. But as Camilla came toward him through the lemon grove, wearing something ivory and simple and entirely herself, he did not think about his father. He thought about his mother, about the woman who had painted in a house that would not let her be, who had stood between a frightened boy and a world that wanted to make him into something efficient, who had taught him to look at things, not at what they appeared to be, but at what they were. He thought about what she would have seen if she could have been there, and he thought she would have seen a garden full of light, and a woman who had walked through every layer of his history and chosen to remain, and a man who had worn silence and control on his knuckles for 19 years and had finally learned the difference between armor and skin. He could not speak when she reached him. The controlled, precise, legendarily composed Il Serpent simply looked at her, and every wall was down, and everything he was, all of it, the darkness and the damage and the discipline and the genuine, fragile, indestructible love of it was visible. She took his hands in hers. Silenzio against her palms. Controllo against her fingers. "You don't have to say anything," she said softly. He looked at her for a moment. The serpent coiled along his neck, patient and still. His eyes were warm. Finally, fully, irrevocably warm. "I know," he said, "but I want to." And he did. He said what he needed to say, simply, without performance, without the careful management of impression that had defined his speech for 2 decades. He said what he had felt from the moment she had stood in a room full of dangerous men and told the truth. He said what he had never said to anyone, and what he understood now had been waiting inside him for 19 years for a person strong enough to receive it. He said he loved her. He said it the way real things are authentic, with all the contradictions intact, with all the history visible, with nothing hidden and nothing performed. The lemon grove was silent. The bay was blue behind the white walls. The serpent was still. Camilla looked at this man, her man, this complicated, careful, deeply human man, and she said it back. And the morning was bright, and the garden was full, and somewhere in the collection on the 2nd floor, Judith watched from her corner with her steady, focused gaze, and everything was, at last, exactly what it claimed to be. Authentic, real, complete. And that is where we leave them, not at the beginning of safety, but at the beginning of something more honest than safety. 2 people who learned to see past armor and name. 2 people who chose the complicated, imperfect, necessary work of genuine love. If this story found you, I hope it stayed with you. I hope it reminded you that the most powerful thing any person can do is choose to be seen, and to see. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.